The night Peter Rhodes heard that Matilda Chandler was leaving the territory of New Mexico. He was 3 whiskeys deep at the Silver Spur Saloon in the dusty town of Redemption, and something inside his chest cracked open like sun-baked earth after a long drought. It was the autumn of 1878, and the territory of New Mexico was a place that could swallow a person whole or spit them out, depending on what it thought of them. Redemption itself sat at the edge of the Rio Puico Valley, a collection of weathered wooden storefronts, a church with a crooked steeple, a handful of adobe homes, and enough red dirt to bury every secret a man or woman had ever carried. The sky above it stretched so wide and so bold that newcomers often stepped off the stagecoach and simply stood there, mouths open, not knowing whether to feel free or terrified. Peter Rhodes was neither a newcomer nor a man easily rattled. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and hands that bore the evidence of a life spent working cattle, mending fences, and coaxing water out of uncooperative land. He had a quiet way about him that people sometimes mistook for coldness, but those who had seen him tend to an injured animal or sit with a grieving neighbor knew better. He had grown up in this territory, had learned to read weather and livestock and land before he had fully learned to read words, and Redemption was the only home he had ever known or wanted. Matilda Chandler, on the other hand, had come to Redemption 3 years ago, arriving on the spring stagecoach with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and the sort of quiet dignity that made people step aside without quite knowing why they had done it. She was 25 now, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned beneath a practical hat during the day and let fall in waves around her shoulders in the evenings when she thought no one was watching. She had amber eyes that shifted color depending on the light, sometimes brown, sometimes gold, and a mouth that curved easily into a smile but could also set itself into a line of absolute determination. She had come to Redemption to take up the position of schoolteacher, the 3rd one the town had hired in 4 years, the previous 2 having been driven off by the combination of unruly students, insufficient pay, and the fundamental hardship of frontier life. Matilda had not been driven off. She had stayed, and she had made the schoolroom into something that mattered. Peter had noticed her within the first week of her arrival. He had been loading feed at Harlow's General Store when the stagecoach pulled in, and he had watched her step down with those 2 trunks and that carpet bag, and he had thought, without any particular fanfare, that she was the most striking woman he had ever seen. Not because she was beautiful in the way that people talked about women being beautiful, though she was that too, but because she had looked at Redemption, at its dust and its roughness and its wide, empty sky, and she had not flinched. He had not said anything to her that day. He had loaded his feed and ridden back to his ranch, and he had told himself that a schoolteacher and a cattleman had nothing particular to say to each other. He had been wrong about that, but it had taken him an embarrassingly long time to find out. Over the following 3 years, their friendship had grown in the careful, unhurried way that things grow in the desert, slowly and with deep roots. They had talked at church socials and town meetings. He had helped her when a late spring snow had damaged the schoolhouse roof, and she could not find anyone willing to fix it on a Sunday. She had lent him books, which he read with more dedication than he let on, and sometimes they had argued about what he had read, and those arguments had been the best conversations he had ever had with anyone. He had told himself, repeatedly and with great conviction, that they were friends. He had told himself this even when he noticed that he laughed more easily around her than around anyone else, even when he caught himself thinking about something she had said 3 days after she had said it, even when he had started taking the long way through town on days he thought she might be out, just on the chance of seeing her. He had been telling himself this lie for 2.5 years when everything changed. The night the news reached him, he was at the Silver Spur because there had been a minor dispute between 2 of the other ranchers that he had helped mediate, and someone had bought him a drink as thanks, and that drink had become 3. He was sitting at a table near the back, half listening to the piano and half thinking about nothing in particular, when Clarence Webb slid into the chair across from him. Clarence ran the telegraph office and knew everything about everyone in Redemption before anyone else did, a quality that made him either an asset or a nuisance depending on the day. He was a lean man with a great mustache and the slightly breathless quality of someone perpetually in the middle of delivering news. "You heard about the Chandler woman," Clarence said, leaning in as though sharing a state secret. Peter set down his glass. "What about her?" "She's leaving, got word today. She sent a telegram to her family back in St. Louis. She's booked passage on the Friday stage." Clarence glanced around, relishing the theater of it. "Going back east for good, from what I can tell. Something about an opportunity there, a proper school with a proper salary, and her mother's been poorly." He paused. "Today's Wednesday, mind you." Peter stared at him. Wednesday. That meant Matilda Chandler had 2 days left in Redemption, and he had not known. She had not told him. And that last fact, more than any other, was what hit him somewhere between the ribs and knocked the air clean out of him. He set his glass down very carefully on the table. He thanked Clarence with a nod that revealed nothing. He walked out of the Silver Spur into the cool October night, and he stood in the dirt street of Redemption for a long moment, looking up at the stars that were so thick and close out here that they seemed almost loud. She was leaving. He tried to arrange his thoughts into something sensible. He told himself that she had every right to go. He told himself that St. Louis would suit her, that she was educated and clever and too good for a dusty frontier town, that she deserved whatever opportunity was waiting for her there. He tried to feel generous about it. What he felt instead was a cold, clean terror. Not the terror of a man afraid of losing comfort or habit, but the terror of a man who has just understood in one blinding moment what it is that he actually wants, and that it is about to leave on a Friday stagecoach, and he will have spent 3 years not saying it. He walked to the stable where his horse was kept, a big roan gelding named Cartwright, and he leaned against the stall for a while, listening to Cartwright breathe. He thought about Matilda's laugh, which was unexpectedly warm for a woman who presented herself with such composure. He thought about the argument they had once had about the novels of Mr. Charles Dickens, which had gone on for nearly 2 hours, and had ended with both of them laughing so hard they could barely speak. He thought about the morning he had found her sitting on the schoolhouse steps at dawn, a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, looking at the mountains with an expression of such pure, quiet love for the landscape that it had stopped him in his tracks. He thought about the fact that he had never once told her any of the things that were currently making it difficult to breathe. He thought about Friday. He saddled Cartwright. It was not quite 9 o'clock in the evening, and Matilda's small rented house was on the east edge of town, a 20-minute ride from the saloon. He could go there tonight. He could knock on her door like a reasonable person and have a reasonable conversation. He could tell her, calmly and with dignity, that he thought she ought to stay, and the reason he thought she ought to stay, and let her decide. That was the sensible thing. He had the reins in his hands, and he was still standing there in the stable doorway when old Gil Hurst, the stableman, appeared from the back room with a lantern and gave him a squinting look. "You riding out this time of night, Rhodes?" "Maybe," Peter said. "Storm coming in from the north," Gil said. "Not a bad one, but enough to make riding unpleasant by midnight." "I appreciate the warning," Peter said, and led Cartwright out into the night. He did not go east toward Matilda's house. He went west. He did not fully understand why until he was already a mile out of town, the lights of Redemption shrinking behind him and the dark desert opening up ahead. He needed to think. He needed the particular kind of thinking that could only happen when there was nothing around him but land and stars and the sound of hooves on packed earth. He had made the mistake once before of going to a woman with only half his heart worked out, saying half what he meant and nothing like what he felt, and it had been a disaster that still embarrassed him when he thought about it. He was not going to do that with Matilda. Matilda deserved the whole truth, clearly stated, nothing withheld. He was going to work out every word of it before he knocked on her door. He rode west for an hour through the cooling desert night, the sage and creosote sharp in the air, Cartwright's breath coming in small puffs of visible warmth as the temperature dropped. The stars above were extraordinary, the Milky Way laid out like a river of cold fire, and Peter thought that this was the kind of sky that no city in the East could offer, and whether that mattered at all to Matilda, and whether he had any right to use it as an argument. He thought about what he knew of her life. She had spoken of her family in St. Louis with affection, and also with a kind of complicated sadness that he had never fully pressed her on. Her mother, she had mentioned once, had never quite understood why she had come west, had written letters full of worry and gentle pressure about coming home to something more suitable. And now her mother was poorly, and Matilda had been offered a position at a proper school with a salary that presumably made what redemption paid look like a joke, which it probably was. He had no counter to any of that. He could not promise her a bigger salary or a healthier mother or a city with proper streets and running water. What he could offer was considerably more modest and considerably harder to put into words. He could offer her the truth. He could tell her that he had been in love with her, quietly and helplessly and without any particular strategy, for the better part of 2 years, and that he had said nothing because he had not known how to say it without frightening her or embarrassing himself, and that he was saying it now because the alternative was watching her climb onto that Friday stage and spending the rest of his life in redemption wondering if a single honest conversation might have changed everything. He could tell her that he wanted to build something with her, if she would have it. That the ranch was in good shape now, better than it had been in his father's time, with a house that had real glass windows and a wood stove that actually drew properly and enough land that he had been turning a profit for 3 straight years. That he was not a wealthy man, but he was a stable one, and that he had thought about the future in the particular way that a man thinks about it when he has started, without admitting it to himself, to imagine someone specific in it. He could tell her that he thought she was extraordinary, that she had walked into redemption and made it better without making a fuss about it. That the children in her schoolroom read and figured and argued and thought because of her, and that the town itself had changed subtly in 3 years in ways that were directly traceable to her presence. That he had watched her navigate the condescension of men who thought a woman had no business having opinions, and the isolation of frontier life, and the loneliness that he suspected she felt but never complained about, and that she had done all of it with a grace that made him feel, by comparison, like something the territory had found under a rock. He could tell her that the territory would be diminished without her, and that he personally would be diminished without her, and that he was not asking her to give up anything, only to consider whether what was here might be worth staying for. That was the speech, more or less, with embellishments as circumstances required. He turned Cartwright around when the first clouds moved in from the north, thin and fast-moving, obscuring the lower stars. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of distant rain, and Peter leaned into it slightly and set a good pace back toward redemption. He had not been riding for more than 20 minutes when he heard a sound that made him pull Cartwright to a quick halt. It was a horse, moving fast, coming from the direction of town, and something about the rhythm of it was wrong, uneven, like a horse being pushed too hard by a rider who was not entirely comfortable with the pace. Peter sat still and waited, and within a minute the horse and rider came into view, a slight figure on a bay mare, pushing the animal at a canter along the road. The figure pulled up sharply when they saw him blocking the path, and in the moonlight that filtered through the clouds, Peter recognized the horse first. It was Lena, the mare that Matilda sometimes borrowed from the livery. The rider was Matilda herself. They stared at each other for a moment, the wind moving between them, Cartwright shifting his weight with a creak of leather. "Matilda," Peter said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. Peter. She had not expected him. He could see the surprise in her posture, the way she straightened slightly. She was wearing her riding coat and her good hat, the one she wore for things that mattered, and she had a saddlebag across the mare's flank that looked packed with something. "What on earth are you doing out here at this hour?" "I could ask you the same," he said. A pause. The wind moved the sage around them. "I needed to ride," she said finally. "I had things on my mind." "So did I," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, and something moved across her face that he could not quite read in the partial moonlight. "I suppose I should turn back," she said. "It's getting cold." "Stay a moment," he said, and something in his voice must have changed her mind, because she did. They sat their horses in the dark road for a moment, close enough that he could hear her breathing, or thought he could. The clouds thickened overhead and a few drops of rain, light and cold, began to fall. "I heard something tonight," he said. "From Clarence Webb." He saw her stiffen. "Clarence Webb talks more than any person alive." "He told me you were leaving," Peter said. "Friday stage." The silence stretched. More rain, still light, tapping on the brim of his hat. "Yes," she said, "just that. Yes." He had hoped foolishly that she might say something that would make it easier, but she only looked at him with those amber eyes that he could barely see properly in the dark, and she said yes. "Were you going to tell me?" he asked, and he kept his voice even with some effort. Another pause, longer this time. "I was going to come by the ranch tomorrow," she said. "I had a letter written." "A letter." "I thought it would be easier," she said, and something in her voice shifted, something that might have been apology or might have been something else entirely. "You are not an easy man to say goodbye to, Peter." The rain came harder now, as Gil had predicted it would. Peter turned up his collar and looked at her, this woman who had a letter written, who had booked a stage, who had decided to leave without telling him in person, and he understood suddenly that her methods, the letter, the avoidance, were not cruelty. They were self-protection, which meant something that made his heart hit harder in his chest. "Come back to town," he said. "We need to talk." "We can talk on the road," she said. "Not in this rain, we can't." He turned Cartwright. "Come on. Jed Palmer's place is half a mile back. We can shelter in his barn until this passes." She hesitated for only a moment before turning the mare and following him. Jed Palmer's farm was dark, the family long since asleep, but the barn was unlocked, as barns in the territory generally were, on the principle that any traveler caught in weather had the right to shelter. Peter led Cartwright inside and Matilda followed with the mare, and he found the lantern that Jed kept on the post inside the door and lit it with the matches from his pocket. And suddenly there was warmth and light, and the smell of hay and the sound of rain hammering on the roof, and they stood there in the middle of it looking at each other. She took off her hat and shook the water from it, and her hair was slightly damp at the edges, and she looked both beautiful and tired, and Peter thought with complete clarity that this was the moment. "I want to know something," he said, "and I want you to answer me honestly." She met his eyes. "All right. Do you want to leave?" She opened her mouth and then closed it again. She looked down at the hat in her hands and then back up at him. "My mother needs me," she said. "And the position in St. Louis is a real position at a proper institution. They will actually pay me what the work is worth. Here I am." She stopped. "Here you are what?" he said. "Here I am making less than any of the men in this town make for comparable work," she said, and there was a quiet heat in her voice that told him this particular frustration had been simmering for some time. "And I am supposed to be grateful for it. And I have been. I have been grateful and patient, and I have told myself that redemption is worth it, that the children are worth it, that the work matters more than the salary, and those things are all true. But Peter, I am 25 years old, and I have been living in a rented room for 3 years, and I cannot pretend indefinitely that it is enough." He took that in. "What would be enough?" he said carefully. She looked at him. The rain was very loud on the roof. One of the horses shifted, blowing softly. "I don't know," she said quietly. "That is an honest answer, I don't know." "Let me tell you something," he said. He took one step toward her, not crowding her, just closing the distance enough that he did not have to raise his voice over the rain. "I have been a fool for 2.5 years, Matilda, a particular kind of fool that I am not proud of." She watched him. Her expression had changed, become more careful, more intent. I have watched you work yourself into the ground for that schoolroom, he said. I have watched you laugh at things that would have sent most people packing. I have watched you argue with the town council about the school budget with more intelligence and more backbone than any of them deserved. And I have watched you lose those arguments because they were small men who could not stand to be outthought by a woman. And I have wanted every single time to say something, and I have not. Peter, I am not finished, he said, and his voice was low and steady, and she went quiet. I should have said it a long time ago. I should have said it the first winter, when you came by the ranch to tell me that my neighbor Harkins was treating his hired men badly, and you thought someone should know. You sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me about it, and you were so angry and so right that I could barely concentrate on what you were saying. He paused. I should have told you then. I did not. And I have been carrying it since, which is no one's problem but my own, but I am telling you now because you are about to get on a stage on Friday, and I would rather make a complete fool of myself tonight than spend the rest of my life wondering. The barn was very quiet except for the rain. Matilda's chin had lifted slightly, and her amber eyes were very bright in the lantern light, and she was looking at him with an expression that he could not fully decipher, which was slightly alarming. "What exactly are you telling me?" she said. He held her gaze. "That I am in love with you," he said. "That I have been in love with you for a long time. That I want you to stay, not because I think I have any right to ask it, but because I want the chance to say these things properly and show you what I mean by them, and I cannot do that if you are in St. Louis." The silence that followed was the longest of his life, or felt like it. Matilda looked at him for what seemed like a very long time. The lantern flame moved gently in the air from the rain gaps in the barn walls, and her shadow moved with it on the hay-scattered floor. She set her hat on a fence rail beside her, and she folded her hands in front of her, and she said, "I have been waiting for you to say something like that for an extremely frustrating amount of time." He stared at her. "An almost unreasonable amount of time," she added. Her voice was steady, but her hands, he noticed, were not entirely still. "Matilda," he said. "I have been trying to make you notice me for 2 years, Peter Rhodes," she said, and now her voice was slightly unsteady and slightly fierce at the same time, which was entirely characteristic of her. "I came by your ranch on the flimsiest pretext I could construct. I lent you every book I thought you might find interesting so that you would have a reason to talk to me. I argued with you about Mr. Dickens for 2 hours, which I would never do with anyone I did not care about because I have better things to do with my time." "You argued because you were right," he said. "I was right," she said, "but I also argued because I did not want to go home." He crossed the remaining distance between them in 2 steps and took her hands, which were indeed not quite steady, in both of his. They were smaller than his and cold from the ride, and she did not pull away. "Why were you leaving without telling me?" he said. His voice was different now, quieter, closer. She looked up at him. "Because I did not think you felt what I felt," she said. "And because I was afraid that if I told you I was going and you simply wished me well, I would not be able to stand it. So I wrote a letter." She paused. "It was a very good letter." "I am sure it was," he said, "but I would have preferred this." Something in her expression broke open then. The composure she wore like a second garment shifted, and underneath it was something much softer and much more real, and she said, "So would I." He held her hands for a long moment, the rain loud above them, the lantern warm between them. Then he said, "What about St. Louis? Your mother?" "My mother is unwell," she said. "That is true, but she is not in danger. She has my brother and his wife nearby, and they manage perfectly well. She writes that she is poorly because she misses me, and she is not wrong. She does miss me, but she is not dying." She paused. "The position in St. Louis is real. The salary is better. Those things are also true." "Would you rather be there?" he said. "Tell me honestly." She was quiet for a moment. The rain had begun to ease slightly, becoming a steady patter rather than a hammering. "I love this territory," she said. "I did not expect to when I came. I thought I was coming for a year or 2 to do something useful and see something of the world outside St. Louis, and then go home to a sensible life." She looked past him for a moment at the barn wall, as though she could see through it to the dark landscape beyond. But then I fell in love with the sky here, and the children, and the way this place is so honest about what it is. It does not pretend to be gentler than it is. It is hard and it is beautiful, and it does not apologize for either. She brought her gaze back to him. And I fell in love with other things too, she said, that I was trying very hard not to think about tonight. He brought her hands up and held them against his chest, and she did not move away, and the distance between them was now so small that when she looked up at him, he could see everything in her eyes, the longing and the uncertainty, and underneath both of them something clear and warm and steady. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Not because I am afraid of losing you, though that is also true, but because I believe we could build something here that would be worth staying for. I have a good ranch, Matilda. It is not fancy, but it is sound, and it is on the best piece of land in the valley, and I have been running it alone for 6 years, and I think it has suffered for that. Not the cattle or the crops, but me." He paused, not entirely comfortable with this level of confession, but committed to it now. "I think I have been going through the motions of a life without quite living one, and I noticed that when you came. I noticed it because every time I talked to you, I felt more alive than I had in years, and every time I rode back to the ranch after one of those conversations, I felt the empty space that you'd left behind." Matilda made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a breath, but something between the two. Her eyes were bright with something that might have been tears, though she clearly had no intention of acknowledging them. "You are considerably more eloquent than I expected," she said. "I have been practicing in my head," he admitted, "for about 2 hours on horseback in the dark." She laughed then, a real laugh, the warm, unexpected one he loved, and the last of the distance between them dissolved, and he released her hands and put his arms around her instead, and she let him, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, and they stood like that in the warm lantern light while the rain came down on Jed Palmer's barn roof, and neither of them felt any particular need to hurry. "I cannot promise you everything you'd have in St. Louis," he said into her hair. "The salary is not going to be better. Redemption is not going to stop being dusty." "I am aware," she said, "but I will treat you like your work matters," he said, "because it does. And I will fight with the town council about your pay until they raise it to something that is not an insult, and I will never, not once, make you feel like your opinions are inconvenient." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Is that a promise?" "That is an absolute promise," he said, "and I do not make promises carelessly." She studied him for a moment with those amber eyes, and whatever she saw in his face seemed to satisfy her, because her expression settled into something warm and certain. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I am not getting on that Friday stage," she said. Something in his chest relaxed that had been coiled tight since Clarence Webb had sat down across from him at the Silver Spur. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Good," he said. "That is very good." She rested her head against his shoulder then, and they stood together in the diminishing rain, and it was simple and it was enough. They rode back to Redemption separately, as propriety required, the rain having nearly stopped by the time they led the horses out of the barn and into the cool, wet dark. The air smelled of wet sage and wet earth, and was cold enough to see their breath. They parted at the edge of town with a handshake that turned into a held hand that he was reluctant to let go of, and she was in no great hurry to reclaim. "Thursday," he said. "Would you have dinner with me Thursday evening? At the hotel restaurant, properly," she smiled. "I would like that very much." He rode back to his ranch in the very early morning, the sky beginning to lighten in the east, and he did not sleep much, but it was not the wakeful restlessness of worry. It was the wide-awake quality of a man who has had his whole life rearranged in the space of an evening, and is still taking stock of the new arrangement. Thursday came in with clear, cold sunlight that made every color in the landscape look sharper than usual. The red of the dirt and the gold of the cottonwood leaves along the creek, and the deep blue of the sky above the mountains to the north. Peter arrived at the hotel in clean clothes he had pressed himself, which he was not entirely certain he had done correctly, and he was waiting in the lobby when Matilda came down the street and pushed open the door. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a deep green that did remarkable things to her amber eyes, and her hair was down in a way she rarely wore it in public, curling softly around her shoulders. She looked at him and her face opened into that smile, the real one, the warm one, and he thought that if this was the version of his life he was being offered, then he was going to do everything in his power to be worthy of it. They ate at a table by the window and talked for 3 hours. Not carefully, the way they had sometimes talked before when both of them were keeping things back, but openly, with the particular relief of two people who have stopped pretending. She told him things she had not told him before, about her childhood innocent. Louis, her father who had died when she was 12, her mother who had rebuilt their lives with a ferocious, quiet competence that Matilda had both admired and sometimes found suffocating. She told him about why she had come west, which was not only the school position, but also something in her that had needed to find out what she was capable of when she had no one familiar around her and no safety net and no choice but to figure it out. He told her things too. About his father, who had driven himself into an early grave trying to make the ranch into something, and who had done so with such grim determination that there had been no room for joy in it. About how Peter had decided, when he inherited the land at 22, that he was going to do it differently, that the ranch was going to be a place where people wanted to be, not just a place that demanded things from them. About how he had mostly achieved this for the cattle and the land, but had somehow forgotten to apply the same philosophy to himself. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention that was one of the things he loved most about her. The kind of listening that made a person feel fully heard rather than merely waited out. By the time the hotel kitchen had long since finished serving and the owner was giving them increasingly pointed looks, they had covered more ground than in the previous 3 years combined, and when they finally walked out into the cool evening, her hand was in his arm and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I need to send a telegram to the stage company," she said, "to cancel my booking." "I'll walk with you," he said. Clarence Webb's eyes lit up like Christmas when they walked into the telegraph office together, and Peter gave him a look that communicated, with some precision, that if this particular piece of news made the rounds before Matilda had a chance to write to her family, there would be consequences of a ranch-related nature. Clarence composed his expression into something more professional, took Matilda's message, and sent it without comment, which was probably a personal record. The weeks that followed were the best weeks Peter could remember. He came to town more than he had before, with considerably better reasons. He found excuses to bring things by the schoolhouse, firewood and supplies that she actually needed, and she found excuses to come out to the ranch, to see the horses, to see the land, to see him. They rode together on Saturday afternoons through the valley, sometimes talking the whole time and sometimes riding in comfortable silence, which was its own kind of intimacy. He watched her write a letter to her mother explaining that she was not coming home, and he watched her face while she did it, the mixture of guilt and resolution, and he did not try to talk her out of the guilt because he thought she had a right to it. He did, however, suggest that perhaps her mother might be invited to visit in the spring, and the expression that moved across Matilda's face at this suggestion, surprise and then a cautious hope, told him it was the right thing to have said. Matilda sent the letter to her mother and received back a reply that was, she told him carefully, not entirely hostile, which he gathered was as good as it was likely to get, at least for now. The town of Redemption, meanwhile, was doing what small towns do when something interesting is happening, which is to say it was watching and commenting at length. The women at the church social had opinions. The men at the Silver Spur had opinions. Old Gil at the stable had opinions and shared them whether solicited or not. None of this particularly troubled Peter, who had never much cared what people said about him, and it did not seem to trouble Matilda either, who had been handling the opinions of others for 3 years and had developed a certain immunity. There was one complication that Peter had not fully anticipated, which announced itself on a gray November morning when a man rode into Redemption on a very good horse and asked for directions to the schoolhouse. His name, they learned quickly, because small towns learn these things quickly, was Arthur Hale. He was from St. Louis. He was 32 years old and he was employed by the school board there, and he was coming, he said, in person to make Miss Chandler a more specific and more generous offer than the one they had already telegraphed, because the board felt she was precisely the kind of educator they needed. Peter heard about this from Gil before noon, and he sat with it for a while before deciding what to do about it. What he did was nothing, which was not as easy as it sounds. He trusted Matilda more than he had ever trusted anyone with this particular quiet territory inside himself, and he knew that trust meant letting her make her own decisions without standing over her shoulder doing the masculine version of worry, which was interference. So he waited, and he worked his fence line that afternoon with perhaps more energy than strictly necessary, and he did not ride into town to find out what Arthur Hale had to say for himself. Matilda came out to the ranch the next morning before school, which was not usual, and he met her at the gate with coffee and 2 cups because he had seen her riding up from the kitchen window, and he had thought, whatever this is, let me meet it with both hands free and something warm to offer. She took the coffee and they sat on the fence rail, and she told him about Arthur Hale and the offer, which was substantially better than the one she had initially received, a real salary and a proper position and the kind of recognition that the work deserved. He listened to all of it. When she was finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at the mountains to the north, which were capped in white now, November having made its feelings known. "I told him no," she said. Peter looked at her. "Matilda, I told him no," she said again, with more emphasis, turning to look at him directly, "because I have thought about it very carefully, and what I want is here. What I want is this territory and this school," and she paused, and something in her expression did the thing it had done in Jed Palmer's barn, the composure shifting to reveal something real underneath. "And you," she said, "I want you. And I am not willing to upend everything I have decided in the past month because a man from a school board arrived with a bigger number." He set down his coffee cup on the fence post behind him and took her hand. "You are certain," he said. Not a question, but she answered it anyway. "Completely," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, which was not something he did as a rule but seemed, at this particular moment, entirely correct, and he felt her fingers tighten around his in response. "Then I have a question," he said, "that I have been working up to for 3 weeks. She looked at him. The morning was cold and bright, and a hawk was riding a thermal above the scrub to the east, and the mountains were white against the blue sky, and she was looking at him with those amber eyes that he had been memorizing for 3 years. "I want to marry you," he said. "If you will have me. I want to make a home with you that is worth coming home to. I want to argue about books with you for the rest of our lives, and I want to know that when I ride in at the end of the day, there is someone there who matters to me more than anything I've built. I want children, if that is something you want, and I want to watch you be their mother because I think you would be extraordinary at it. I want all of it with you in this territory for as long as we have." He paused. "I know that is a great deal to want, but I would rather ask too much than say too little. I have already learned that lesson." Matilda looked at him for a long moment in which the hawk above them made its slow circle, and the horses in the near pasture moved with their quiet morning patience. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely, entirely, yes." He pulled her toward him and she came willingly, and they were on a fence rail in the cold November morning, and he kissed her for the first time, and it was warm and certain, and it tasted like coffee and possibility. Clarence Webb, as it happened, had ridden out to check something at the property line nearby, and witnessed what he later described to anyone who would listen as the most romantic thing he had ever seen. a fact that Peter disputed on the grounds that Clarence had ridden past a fence rail 300 yards from the nearest property line for no conceivable reason other than nosiness, and that the privacy of the moment had been somewhat compromised. Matilda said it did not matter, that the moment had happened and was theirs regardless of who had witnessed it, and that Clarence would have found out within the hour anyway. She was right on both counts, and Peter told her so. The winter of 1878 moving into 1879 was cold, but not brutal, one of those high desert winters that announce themselves clearly, and then mostly keep their promises without extravagance. Peter and Matilda were married in December, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a Saturday that was clear and cold, and so bright with reflected light from the thin snow on the ground that people squinted even indoors. The Reverend Mitchell performed the service with his customary gravity, and the congregation, which was more or less the entire town of Redemption, and a few people from the outlying ranches who had come specifically for this, was in exceptionally good spirits. Matilda wore a dress that she and Mrs. Elspeth Harding had made together, deep cream wool with small buttons up the back, and she had her hair pinned up with 2 combs that had belonged to her grandmother. And Peter, who had never in his life spent more than a moment concerned with his own appearance, had stood in the church and watched her walk down the aisle and felt as though the whole world had narrowed down to this one point of light. They said their vows clearly and looked at each other while they said them, which was not the custom exactly, but seemed to both of them the only reasonable way to do it. After the service, there was a gathering at the town hall with food that half the women in Redemption had contributed to, and music from the fiddle player who came through 3 times a year, and dancing that went on past 10 o'clock, which was extremely late by Redemption standards. Peter danced with his wife, which was a thought that still had the quality of something fresh-minted and remarkable, and she was a better dancer than him, and she did not make him feel bad about this, which he took as further evidence that he had made an excellent decision. Her mother had not come for the wedding. She had written a letter that was, Matilda told him, warmer than she had expected, with a kind of cautious blessing that acknowledged she did not fully understand her daughter's choices but loved her nonetheless. Peter thought that was more honest than most people managed, and he told Matilda so, and she had looked at him with the particular expression she used when he said something that landed exactly right. They set up their life in the ranch house together, which required some reorganization because Peter had been living as a single man, and some of his domestic habits were, Matilda told him firmly but without cruelty, going to require adjustment. He adjusted them. She brought her books, which filled the shelves he built along the parlor wall over the course of a January weekend, and she brought her teaching materials, and she brought a quilt her grandmother had made and a photograph of her family in St. Louis, and a small framed print of a painting she had always loved, and the house, which had been functional but spare, became something that felt lived in and warm and full. She continued teaching. This had never been in question between them, but Peter made sure that it remained so by riding to town with her on the mornings he could spare and meeting with the town council in February to argue, with patient and thorough persistence, for an adjustment to her salary. He brought documentation of comparable positions in other territories. He brought data on the performance of Redemption students against published standards. He sat in that meeting room with 3 men who were not accustomed to being argued with on behalf of a woman's wages, and he was polite and immovable and extremely well prepared. They raised her salary, not to what she deserved, he thought, but substantially. Matilda read the letter informing her and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you," in a voice that was simple and meant entirely. "It should have been done before I had to argue for it," he said. "Yes," she said, "but you argued for it. That is not nothing." Spring came to the valley in March with the tentative quality it always had in the high desert, warm days and cold nights, and the arroyos running with snowmelt and the first green pushing up in the pastures. Matilda's mother came to visit in April, a journey that had required some courage on everyone's part, and Alina Chandler arrived on the stage looking both more formidable and more uncertain than Matilda had described. And Peter met her at the stage and introduced himself and shook her hand and looked her in the eye, and she looked back with the amber-eyed assessment that he recognized immediately as her daughter's inheritance. Alina Chandler spent 2 weeks in redemption. By the end of the first week, she had revised several of her assumptions. By the end of the second, she had told Peter, during a conversation in the kitchen while Matilda was at the schoolhouse, that she had come expecting to disapprove of him, and that she found she could not quite manage it, and that she supposed he would do. He thanked her gravely and she smiled, which transformed her face entirely, and he understood where Matilda's smile had come from and liked this woman considerably more than he had at the start of her visit. She went back to St. Louis with a promise to return in the autumn and with something different in her bearing, a kind of settled quality, as though she had gone looking for reassurance and found it. The summer of 1879 was good. The ranch was productive. The cattle came through the dry season in fine condition because Peter had spent 3 winters improving the water systems, and the pastures held their grass longer than in previous years. He hired 2 extra hands for the summer work, brothers named Tomás and Luis Vega, who had come up from further south and who were good with horses and good-natured about the long hours. And the ranch ran with a smoothness that allowed Peter, for the first time in years, to occasionally take a full afternoon off without the ceiling falling in. He spent those afternoons with Matilda when she was not teaching, riding the valley or sitting on the porch in the long golden evenings watching the light move on the mountains. She had started writing, in addition to her teaching, essays about education and about the frontier that she sent to a journal in Denver, and 2 of them had been published, which delighted her and which Peter read with the particular pride of someone who had always known exactly how capable she was. In September, Matilda told him, quietly, and with a smile that held a complicated mixture of joy and nervousness, that she was expecting a child. He was quiet for a moment that she later told him had frightened her slightly, and then he had crossed the kitchen and picked her up, which surprised both of them, and she had laughed and put her hands on his face, and he had held on to her for a long time. The pregnancy was not easy. She was ill in the mornings for the first 3 months in a way that required her to eat plain biscuits before she got out of bed and to approach the beginning of each day with tactical caution. She was tired in a bone-deep way that she did not complain about, but that he could see in her face. She continued teaching through the autumn because she was Matilda and stopping was not in her vocabulary unless absolutely necessary, and Peter made sure that the other women in redemption who had made this journey before her were available and willing to help, which they were, because Matilda had spent 3 years doing things for this community, and the community knew it. The town of Redemption in 1879 was not an easy place to be a woman navigating pregnancy. There was no doctor in town, only old Doc Ferris, who was competent at setting bones and treating common ailments, but who was honest about the limits of his knowledge in obstetric matters. The nearest proper doctor was a full day's ride away, which made everyone somewhat nervous. Peter had ridden to Santa Fe in October and spoken at length with a physician there, and he came back with written guidance, and with the name of a midwife in the nearest settlement to the west, a capable woman named Mrs. Aguilar who had attended more than 200 births and who agreed to come to the ranch when the time approached. Matilda found this practical preparation both touching and slightly amusing. "You have organized this like a cattle drive," she told him. "I prefer to be prepared," he said. "I noticed," she said. "It is one of the things I love about you." He looked at her. She said things like this sometimes with complete simplicity, without build-up or announcement, and it still reached him every time with the same quality of something unexpected and wonderful. "I love you," he said. She smiled. "I know," she said, "and I love you. Now come and sit with me. My back is terrible this evening." He sat with her and she leaned against him and they watched the fire, and it was entirely sufficient. The baby came in April of 1880, a son, which surprised neither of them since Matilda had had a feeling about it for months that she had communicated with the quiet certainty of someone who trusted her own instincts. Mrs. Aguilar arrived 2 days before and stayed through the birth, which was long and difficult, and which Peter spent in the kitchen with Doc Ferris, who had come out as well, both of them applying themselves to the business of staying useful and not catastrophizing. He brought water and clean cloths and did everything that was asked of him, and when Mrs. Aguilar finally came to the kitchen door and told him he had a son, and that his wife was tired but well, he sat down very suddenly in the nearest chair, and Mrs. Aguilar, a woman not given to sentiment, patted his shoulder twice with something like kindness. They named the boy Daniel, after Peter's father, which had been Matilda's suggestion, and which had undone him slightly when she made it. Daniel Rhodes arrived in the world with excellent lungs and strong opinions about when he wanted to eat, and he had Matilda's amber eyes and Peter's tendency toward silence on the occasions when he was not making himself heard, which his parents found both familiar and entertaining. Matilda went back to teaching in September, when Daniel was 5 months old, which she managed with the logistical creativity that had always been one of her distinguishing qualities. Mrs. Garza, the wife of one of the neighboring ranchers, took Daniel during school hours in exchange for Matilda tutoring her 2 elder children in reading, an arrangement that satisfied everyone, and that became so comfortable it lasted for years. The years settled into themselves with a warmth and substance that Peter sometimes had to stop and take stock of, because he had not fully anticipated being this content, and he did not want to take it for granted. He had grown up watching his father be consumed by the ranch in a way that left nothing for the people around it, and he had promised himself a different version, and he was living it. In the spring of 1882, Matilda discovered she was expecting again. This time the pregnancy was easier in the mornings but harder in the summer heat, and she finally agreed in August to let someone else teach the remaining weeks before the September term and rest, which she found extremely difficult but which she managed with grace that he suspected cost her more than she let on. Their second child was a girl, born in October 1882, whom they named Eleanor Rose, the Eleanor for Matilda's mother and the Rose because Matilda had wanted one botanical name in the family and it suited her. Matilda Chandler, the grandmother, came from St. Louis for this birth and stayed for 3 weeks, and held her granddaughter with an expression that removed any remaining uncertainty about whether she had made peace with her daughter's life in the territory. Daniel, by this point 2.5 years old, and possessed of a personality that was already clearly going to require considerable management over the coming years, was interested in his sister primarily as a novelty and secondarily as a cause for concern, because she was extremely small and he was not convinced of her durability. Peter watched him hover near the cradle with that worried frown and thought, "This is mine, this extraordinary small creature and this woman and this family," and felt the weight of it as a privilege. He had built on the ranch house by then, added 2 rooms and expanded the porch so that it ran the length of the house and caught the evening light in the summer. Matilda had planted a kitchen garden and a small flower bed that was not particularly necessary and entirely important, and the ranch had the quality of a place that was cared for rather than merely maintained. Tomás and Luis Vega had stayed on, permanent hands now, with a small bunkhouse of their own that Peter had built in 1880. They were good men, and they had become part of the rhythm of the place in a way that felt right. Peter was aware, not in a self-congratulatory way but in a practical way, that he was doing better by his workers than most ranchers in the territory, paying fairly and on time and treating men as though their labor had dignity, which it did. He had seen enough of the other kind of ranching to know what it produced, which was resentment and corners cut, and the particular slow deterioration of a place where people did not want to be. He wanted people to want to be here. In 1883, the town of Redemption got its first proper doctor, a young man named Dr. Samuel Tate, who had studied in Philadelphia and come west because he found the frontier more interesting than a city practice, which endeared him to most of the town immediately. He set up his office above the hardware store, and within 3 months was so thoroughly embedded in the community that it was difficult to remember what they had done without him. He and Peter became friends, which Peter later thought was perhaps inevitable because Dr. Tate was curious about everything, and Peter had married a woman who found incurious people somewhat exhausting. Matilda and Dr. Tate were immediately mutual admirers, in the collegial way of two people who recognize in each other a similar quality of mind. They argued, amiably and at great length, about medicine and education, and the state of the territory, and the question of what the government owed the people who lived in it, including, and especially the people the government had spent considerable energy treating badly. Matilda had opinions about this that she expressed without apology, about the Apache people who had been driven from lands they had held for generations, about the treatment of the Mexican families who had been in the territory far longer than most of the Anglo settlers, about the way justice seemed to operate differently depending on who you were and what you looked like. Peter had always shared these views, though he expressed them differently, more quietly, in the particular way he conducted himself, paying Tomás and Louis the same as his other hands, treating the Apache families he occasionally encountered with the basic respect that was owed to any human being, refusing to participate in the kind of talk that dismissed whole categories of people as less than what they were. But Matilda put words to it in a way that made him think harder about it, and he was grateful for that. They had disagreements too, real ones. They disagreed about Daniel's education, about how much freedom was appropriate, about when to push and when to let go, with Peter inclined toward independence and Matilda inclined toward structure, and they worked it out by talking, which was not always comfortable but was always productive. They disagreed once, in 1884, about whether to sell a portion of the ranch land to a land company from back east that was offering good money, with Peter initially seeing the financial appeal and Matilda arguing, with considerable passion, that the company's practices were not ones they wanted to be associated with, and that the money was not worth the compromise. He sat with her argument for a week and decided she was right, and he told her so, and the expression on her face told him that being heard mattered as much as being agreed with. Daniel started school in the autumn of 1885, in the classroom that his mother had been running for 7 years. This created some delightfully complicated dynamics that Matilda navigated with a professionalism and a suppressed amusement that Peter admired enormously. Daniel, for his part, was simultaneously mortified and proud to have his mother as his teacher, which was a combination of feelings that he expressed through being alternately extremely well-behaved and extremely disruptive, in a pattern that Matilda decoded within a week and addressed with a directness that Daniel respected because he had grown up knowing what his mother's directness felt like. Eleanor, who would begin school in another 2 years, was watching this from the sidelines with the interested calculation of a younger sibling gathering intelligence. On an evening in October 1885, 7 years after Peter had ridden out into the night desert and found Matilda on the road toward town, they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the last of the autumn warmth. Daniel was asleep. Eleanor was in her crib. The sky was doing the thing it did in October in this valley, turning colors that no painter had ever quite got right, great swaths of amber and rose, and a deep particular blue at the zenith that was not quite any other color. Matilda had a shawl around her shoulders and a cup of tea cooling in her hands, and she was looking at the mountains, which were lit gold along their tops by the last of the sun. She had a few fine lines at the corners of her eyes now that had not been there 7 years ago, and she wore her hair differently, looser, and she was 28, no, 32 now, and she was more entirely herself than the woman who had arrived on the spring stage in 1875, and Peter found her more beautiful than he had when she stepped off it. He was watching her instead of the sky, and she knew it because she turned to look at him with the slight smile of someone used to being looked at in this particular way. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about the night you were leaving." She raised her eyebrows. "Were you?" "I think about it sometimes," he said. How close it was, how differently it could have gone. She was quiet for a moment, looking back at the mountains. "I think about it too," she said. "I think about the letter I had written." "I am glad I never received it," he said. "So am I," she said. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, laced her fingers through his. "Though I would like to think I would have come back." "Would you?" he said. She considered this seriously, which was characteristic of her. "I think," she said slowly, "that I was already looking for a reason to stay. I just needed you to give me one." "I nearly did not," he said. "I spent 2 years not saying it." "You were a very stubborn man," she agreed. "I was," he said. "I am somewhat less so now." "Somewhat," she said, with the warmth in her voice that he had learned over 7 years, was one of the most specific kinds of happiness he knew. He held her hand in the cooling evening air, and they watched the color drain slowly from the mountains, and the stars come out one by one. The same stars he had been looking at the night Clarence Webb told him she was leaving. The stars that had been over the desert when he rode out and worked out what he was going to say. "I want you to know something," he said, "on the chance that I do not say it often enough." She turned to look at him. "That you are the best thing in my life," he said. "Not the children, though they are part of it, but you specifically, the way you think, the way you argue, the way you love this place and these people, the way you have made everything here more worth having." He paused. "I want you to know that I know it, not just that I feel it, but that I know it clearly and that I am not taking it for granted." She was quiet for a moment that stretched out in the comfortable way that only happened between people who had nothing to prove to each other. "Peter Rhodes," she said finally, in a voice that was soft and certain, "you are a very good man." "I am trying to be," he said. "You are succeeding," she said, "consistently, which is harder than trying." He brought her hand up and pressed it to his lips, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that while the full dark came down over the valley and the stars filled in above the ranch house, and somewhere in the scrub a coyote called, and the sound of it was the territory announcing itself, wild and constant and unchanged. The following spring, Matilda discovered she was expecting a third child, which news was received with joy that was only slightly modified by the memory of how hard the previous 2 pregnancies had been. Dr. Tate was on hand now, which made the practical anxiety considerably less acute. The pregnancy proceeded through the summer of 1886 with Matilda's characteristic combination of practicality and refusal to stop doing the things she considered important, which meant she was still teaching in September and still arguing with the town council in October, and only finally consented to rest in November, when she was very large and the territory was cold, and she admitted that possibly the moment had come. The third child arrived in December 1886, a second son, healthy and full-voiced and immediately opinionated about his circumstances, whom they named William James, James for no particular reason except that it suited him. Daniel was 6, and Alina was 4, and they received their new brother with the specific combination of curiosity and territorial concern that siblings everywhere have brought to this situation since the beginning of human time. Christmas 1886 in the ranch house was loud and warm, and crowded with children and neighbors and Mrs. Aguilar, who had become a fixture in the family over the years, and Tomás and Louis with their own families now, 2 young men who had built lives in the valley, and the kitchen was full of good food, and the house smelled of pine, and the fire was burning well, and Matilda stood in the middle of all of it with William on her hip, and Daniel arguing with Alina about something in the corner, and Peter watching her from the kitchen doorway, and their eyes met across the room. She smiled at him. "Full one," the warm, unexpected one that he had loved since the first time he heard it in the Silver Spur of all places, when she had been arguing with someone at a church social about the school budget, and she had won the argument and then laughed with a delight that had nothing performative about it. He crossed the room to her and took William from her arms, which gave her both hands free, and she put one of them on his chest and he covered it with his own. "Happy," he said quietly. "Entirely," she said. Outside, the territory went on doing what it always had, immense and complicated and honest about what it was, full of hardship and beauty, and the specific kind of freedom that comes from a place that does not pretend to be other than itself. The Rio Puico ran cold and low in its winter bed. The mountains to the north held their snow. The stars above the valley were thick and extraordinary, the same stars that had been there the night Peter Rhodes rode out into the dark and found the woman he loved on a road in the desert, and the same stars that would be there long after all of them were gone. But for now, in the ranch house in December 1886, with 3 children and a warm fire, and the woman he had nearly let ride out of his life forever standing beside him with her hand on his chest, Peter Rhodes felt the kind of happiness that does not announce itself with trumpets but settles in like good wood in a well-built fire, steady and deep, and built to last. Matilda leaned her head against his shoulder, exactly as she had on the porch the previous autumn, and he held his son in one arm and put his other arm around his wife, and the room around them was full of the noise and warmth of the life they had built together, stitch by careful stitch, honest word by honest word, over 7 years in the territory that had made them both. Daniel came running from the corner, a leaner in pursuit, and collided with Peter's legs and grabbed hold of them as though they were a fixed point in a fast-moving world. And Peter looked down at him and then across at Matilda, and she was trying very hard not to laugh and failing, and the sound of her laughter in the full warm room was the best sound in the territory. He held on to all of them and thought that this, precisely this, was what a life was supposed to feel like. And out on the dark road, where a younger version of himself had once ridden through the night with his heart in his mouth and the right words finally in his head, the cold wind moved through the sage and the stars burned without comment, and redemption sat in its small bright cluster of lights beneath the vast and patient sky, and nothing more was needed. The years that followed did not bring them ease without effort or happiness without its complications, because life in the territory was too honest for that, but they brought the deeper satisfaction of 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of what they were choosing, and who had meant it, and who kept on meaning it. Matilda taught until 1891, when the school had grown large enough that the town council, finally and with considerably less argument than in previous years, hired a second teacher. She did not stop being involved in the schoolroom entirely, but she had more time, and she used it for her writing, which had found a readership beyond Denver by then, essays and observations about frontier education and women's work, and the complicated business of building communities in hard places. She received letters in response from women across the Western territories who recognized themselves in what she wrote, and she answered every one of them. Daniel grew into a serious, perceptive boy who had his mother's mind and his father's steadiness, and a particular gift for mathematics that neither of them could fully account for. Alina grew into a girl of such spirited and comprehensive opinions that even Matilda sometimes found it necessary to take a breath before responding, which she did with the self-awareness of someone who recognized the quality from her own mirror. William, the youngest, was gentle in a way that surprised everyone and touched his parents quietly and deeply, a child who found injured animals in the pasture and carried them home with such careful deliberateness that Peter began to suspect they had a future doctor on their hands. By the time the decade turned and redemption grew and changed and took on more of the shape of a proper town, the Rhodes Ranch was a known and stable place in the valley, respected not for its size, though it had grown some, but for the way it was run and for the people who ran it. And on autumn evenings, When the light was right and the children were occupied and the day's work was done, Peter and Matilda would sit on the long porch in the chairs they had bought together in 1881, and they would watch the sky change over the mountains. And sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not. And in either case, the silence and the speaking were equally full. He never stopped being glad he had ridden out that night. She never stopped being glad she had turned the mare and followed him back to the shelter of that lamplit barn. And Redemption, dusty and complicated and beautiful under its enormous sky, went on being the only place either of them had ever truly needed to be.